I am thrilled to welcome you all. My name is Yosra Amraoui. I'm the Vice President of TAX. TAX is the Tunisian Association for American Cultural Studies, and it's an association that promotes studies and research about the United States, whether politics, history, or culture. We are 1 year old, but we've been so blessed to having organized our first international conference last year on heroes and villains, and we are delighted to invite you to our second international conference on justice and morality in October in Sousse in Tunisia this year. This book discussion series is entitled New Roots in Transnational American Studies, which TAX and the Center for Global American Studies co-run. I am proud to co-run this with my dear colleague, John. I would like to tell you how thrilled we are to discuss the Internal Colony by Sam Klug, and to also announce that the next webinar will be about Cartographies of Empire by our lovely Micah Tucker-Abramson in September this year. So I give you the floor now, John, to introduce yourself and the center.
Thank you, Yosra. Thanks so much. And hi again, everybody. So I'm John Munro. I teach in the history department at the University of Birmingham, and I also co-direct the Center for Global American Studies there, which I co-direct with my colleague, Rona Cran.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Great. And so what we're going to do, we got a great lineup of speakers, obviously. Yosra, I'm going to turn it back over to you to just introduce the readers, and then I will introduce Sam and the book.
Thank you, John. I have the pleasure today to welcome Dr. Wassel Borghol from Tunisia. Wassel is a TAX member and a researcher in American studies, specializing in race studies, media discourse, and computational linguistics. His work explores resistance movements, political rhetoric, and digital narratives in the US context. He teaches at Sciences Po and La Nouvelle Sorbonne, linking critical theory with hands-on pedagogy. I also have the incredible pleasure, I'm a fan of Glen Coulthard. Professor Glen Coulthard is a member of the Yellowknives Dean First Nation and director of the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia. He also is a co-founder of the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning, and he's author of the award-winning book, Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. We also have with us the wonderful Priyamvada Gopal, professor of post-colonial studies in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge. She is the author of 3 books, most recently Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Descent. Priya is currently...
What time you got to be there tomorrow?
Sorry?
It's
Priya is currently on a Liverpool Major Research Fellowship working on decolonization. We also have Dayo Gore, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Black Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Gore received her PhD in history from New York University and has previously taught at the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Massachusetts. Amherst. Professor Gore is the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African-American Women Activists in the Cold War, and editor of Want to Start of Revolution, Radical Women in the Black Freedom Struggle. She is completing a book-length study on Black women's transnational travels and activism in the long 20th century, and is a member of the leadership team of Scholars for Social Justice. We also have the pleasure to welcome John Narayan, who is chair of the Institute of Race Relations and a member of the Race and Class Editorial Working Committee. He works on political theory and the linkages between globalization, inequality, and racialization, and on the global aspects of anti-racist and democratic politics. A senior lecturer in European and International Studies at King's College London, John has published in such venues as Third World Quarterly, Theory, Culture, and Society, Current Sociology, and the Sociological Review. Over to you, John.
Great, thanks, Yosra. So now to introduce Sam Klug, the author who will respond to the readers' comments. Sam is an assistant teaching professor of history at Loyola University, Maryland. His first book, of course, the one that we're here to discuss, The Internal Colony, Race and the American Politics of Global Decolonization, was published by the University of Chicago Press earlier this year. His writing has appeared in Diplomatic History, the Journal of the History of International Law, Politico Magazine, Dissent, Boston Review, and more. I'm not going to say too much to introduce Sam's book because obviously that's what we're here to discuss. I'll just say the book tells a story about colonial comparison in order to chart the impact of decolonization on liberal and radical politics within the US from the end of World War II to the eve of the Reagan era. Along the way, and through an engagement with the ideas and activities of a wide-ranging cast of activists and intellectuals, The Internal Colony renders our portrait of domestic developments within the United States as missing an essential dimension without reference to the colonial, neo-colonial, and post-colonial order of the world. And it prompts new ways of thinking about the colonial structure of the United States itself. So, Yosra, I'll turn it back to you to moderate the panel. And Wassel, I believe you are first up.
Yes, we have the pleasure to start with Wassel Borghol. Over to you, Wassel. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Yosra. Hello, everyone. So as Yosra introduced, my name is Wassel. I'm a researcher working on race studies. And I am delighted to be here among you today. And I'm glad to be speaking. Of course, I think that the best thing I liked about this book is that I've been a researcher for the past maybe 4 years. And even though I read a lot of literature about race theories, about critical race theory, etc., the concept of internal colony is a concept that, to me at least, was very, I wouldn't say that I have known this concept before, so it was a pleasure to not only discover it, but understand how it challenges the traditional views of national unity and progress, and how it reveals how racism is structured, and these profound inequalities and internal dominations. For example, if we look at economic marginalization, if we look at segmented labor markets, resource extraction, if we look at political exclusion and surveillance, all of these are forms of colonization that we do not necessarily identify as colonization at first. So what I like about this concept is that it also brings out these sort of beneath the surface forms of colonization. And again, to me, as someone who worked on the Black Lives Matter movement, I see this discussion as very pertinent to what's happening today. If you look at racial and indigenous oppression, I mean, many indigenous people and racial minorities today, they experience conditions that are akin to internal colonialism, displacement, poverty, policing, lack of political sovereignty. I mean, the book's framework, it helps explain why these issues today still persist, and I mean, despite formal legal equality. I think that it also does a good job at highlighting inequality and links to capitalism. It highlights decolonization and the discussion around social justice movements. I think particularly in the chapter that I was especially focused on, which is the 8th chapter linked to discourse in Black liberation movements. I think that this really resonated with a lot of what I have tried to do in my own research, in the sense that I have tried to understand today how the Black Lives Matter movement structures the debates around equality and around racism using specific terms. I have analyzed the most frequently used hashtags and the most frequently used words. And so to link this to the idea of internal colonialism, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement also focused on internal colonization of African Americans in the US. We talked about the segmented labor market. We talked about economic exploitation. We talked about the spatially confined African Americans in the US. So all of these are issues that unfortunately still persist until today, even though the focus of the book was mainly in the post-World War II era. Something that I can also link to my area of research and that I have found interesting is how in the 1960s Black Power activists they called for internal decolonization through uplifting, through creating positive communities. And this is something that I have perceived, given that the Black Lives Matter movement tries to use a positive and uplifting discourse. So again, all of these are ideas that rather link my research topic to this book, which is why I found it specifically interesting when it comes to terminology, when it comes to critical discourse, when it comes to the choice of words. And another reason why I found the topic especially pertinent today is with the ongoing digitalization and globalization, we no longer perceive, I would say, colonialism as a specific phenomenon happening in one region of the world. It is today we talk about global solidarity, about the internationalization of racism, and how small movements, small resistance movements try to create links with each other. They work on this transnational resistance and intersectionality, which is a concept in critical race theory that is, again, it can be linked to a lot of ideas mentioned in the 8th chapter of this book. So overall, I don't really want to take a lot of time, but I just wanted to say that first, to me, the idea of internal colonies, and it sort of shifted a bit my way of thinking of colonialism, in the sense that we generally focus on the internal versus the external group, whereas generally a lot of colonialism actually happens in the same group itself that is suffering from colonialism. So it's a bit of a paradigm shift. It is very pertinent today for the reasons I have just mentioned. And again, to me, as a researcher working on the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that the link is obvious, and I think that the topic is very, very up to date. Yosra, I don't know if for the questions we're going to regroup the questions later, or do you want each of us to ask his own questions?
Thank you, Wassel. Please ask your question now, and then we'll see if Sam will be able to answer some or all of them later.
Okay. So my first question would be, and again, this is rather an opening of a conversation more than a question. How do you see today the concept of internal colony evolving in the face of globalization, digital technologies that reshape not only social but also economic relations with nation states? Is it a concept that we're going to refer to more and more in the future, or less and less with globalization, with the evolution of digital technologies? And I cannot but ask a question that also specifically interests me is, in what ways do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement reflects the challenges and the dynamics of internal colonialism? Is it really something that, when writing this book, came to your mind? Is it something that sort of inspired you to go in this, or do you not see this as something necessarily linked to the Black Lives Matter movement? I think that's all for me. Thank you very much again for this opportunity, and I am very glad to have been able to share my views and my questions.
Thank you so much, Wassel. I'm sure Sam has taken note of your questions and comments. I'm going to give the floor now to Professor Glen Coulthard. You have the floor.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank John and Yosra for inviting me, and I'd especially like to thank Sam for writing such a wonderful book. The book offers an invigorating intellectual and political genealogy of how the concept of the internal colony or internal colonialism emerged and transformed in mid-20th century America, shaping radical African-American critiques of U.S. racial capitalism, as well as strategies to overcome it. More specifically, Klug traces the political history of the internal colony thesis, showing how Black radicals framed American or African Americans as internally colonized peoples, thus providing an alternative to liberal and civil rights integrationism, by instead linking the Black freedom struggle to anti-imperialist and decolonial movements abroad. The internal colony position emphasized intrastate domination, economic extraction, police occupation, and cultural imperialism, drawing parallels between urban ghettos in the U.S. and colonized territories in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Crucially, Krug situates the decline of the political purchase of the internal colony thesis in part in a broader context of indigenous dispossession and settler colonialism. He examines how indigenous movements across North America, particularly during the late 1960s to mid-1970s Red Power era, challenged the limits of the internal colony thesis by insisting on the primacy of land, sovereignty, and nationhood. While Black radicals emphasized internal colonization, indigenous thinkers pushed for a distinct analysis of what is now termed settler colonialism, based not only on economic exploitation, but on territorial dispossession and the usurpation of sovereign governing authority. Now, before my questions, I wanted to first say how useful I found this text for personal research interests. I'm currently writing a book on Red Power internationalism in Canada during the long 1970s, and a critical turning point in that movement's political economic analysis came in the wake of the coup in Ghana and the Black left's resultant turn towards Tanzania as the beacon of third world liberation. The genealogy that Sam provides critically recasts or casts the origin story of how the internal colony thesis, as a post-colonial form of colonialism both abroad and at home, came to have political purchase it did back into the early 20th century of Black internationalism. And I thank him for kind of expanding my periodization there. Here are my key questions. In chapter 8, you recognize the significance of Frantz Fanon on the Black left's theorization of African American life as a form of internal colonialism. Obviously, this is correct. I'm just wondering about the political and theoretical influence of the PRC under Chairman Mao's leadership, however. In two well-known statements made by Mao in support of the Black freedom struggles in 1963 and 1968, he situates African American liberation in decidedly internationalist terms against U.S. colonialism and imperialism. Now, Mao never developed a fully systemized theory of internal colonialism in the way that others did, but aspects of his writings, particularly on national minorities, class contradiction, and uneven development, anticipate the concept. His work laid important groundwork that influenced revolutionary movements across, of course, the global south, but also many Black power thinkers and organizations examined in your book. Did your research find any influences in this regard? And then my second question, one of your claims regarding the decline of the internal colony thesis had to do with its seemingly contradictory position with respect to indigenous dispossession and forging relations of effective solidarity and coalition with other, quote, oppressed groups in the U.S., at least in part. Here you mentioned Vine Deloria Jr.'s at times positive appraisal of Hamilton and Carmichael's invocation of a right to self-determination for national minorities in the U.S., yet also very dismissive and simplistic juxtaposition of red and Black struggles in the States. This isn't so much a question as it is a comment. I think it's interesting to look at the ways in which the internal colony thesis is taken up in settler colonial contexts outside, but adjacent to the US, like in Canada, for instance. The Native Alliance for Red Power, or NARP, and Ray Bob, one of its key figures, engaged with the idea of internal colonialism as a central analytic for understanding the conditions of Indigenous peoples in Canada during the late 1960s and early 1970s. They did so, however, without the same contradiction. Similar to settler colonial studies after it, the internal colonialism perspective instead insisted that racial marginalization and subordination must be understood through the lens of colonialism and imperialism as a persistent and ongoing process. Unlike too much literature in the field of white settler colonial studies, however, the normative stakes for non-Indigenous communities are much clearer when looked at through the internal colonialism frame like Bob and NARP did. They, like Indigenous peoples, ought to be understood, ought to be considered beneficiaries of decolonization afforded through their own access to the right to self-determination. NARP or Ray Bob found no inconsistency with this claim coexisting with their own land and sovereignty struggles, like Deloria Jr. seems to imply. Under such a framework, the specificity of our respective experience of anti-Black, racialized, and colonial violences did not translate into the political incommensurabilities that seem at times to haunt our solidarity efforts today. I think at core, or the core normative framework undergirding this commitment is a non conception of land and non-exclusionary conception of sovereignty and self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Coulthard. And now I give the floor to Professor Priya Gopal.
Thank you, Yosra and John, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And like Glen, I'd like to thank Sam for writing this book, which was an enormous pleasure to read. It was so meticulously researched and populated by so many legendary characters. I could see, more than one movie coming out of the kind of debates and disagreements in this book. I was struck by both how steeped these debates were by their historical moment, but also how they hold so much resonance for our global present. And that's what I think I'll try and draw out in my brief remarks. I don't know if we were instructed specifically to have questions. I have sort of problems that I'm commenting on that I invite Sam to address if he so wishes. One of the kind of key questions or points in the book that really guides it is how decolonization, global decolonization, that is in Africa and the wider third world project, shaped debates on African-American Black debates and discussions and thought. But for me, the book also raises implicitly in reverse the question of the resonances of these debates on the internal colony and what they have for our engagement with decolonization in the present. And I mean in the present, not in the Bandung moment alone. I think, in fact, that the idea of the internal colony, which I know fell into disrepute for a while, but for me, I think the idea of the internal, if we put quotation marks around internal, has a great deal of analytical and political valences for our present. And I'm saying that because I think some of the most fundamental movements of decolonization in the kind of medium present, in the last 30, 40 years and contemporarily, are actually against present day nation states, including nation states of what we call the global South. So, I mean, that's the kind of question that I have been thinking about when reading the book. The other point is about, I think the book invites us to think about, is the question of what colonization is and what a colony is, again, in the present day. It is, on the one hand, difficult to define precisely, but on the other hand, I think, along with Du Bois and Sam's discussion of Du Bois, that it is some combination of racialization, exploitative economic relations, anti-democratic structures, although the question of what the nature of the democracy is also important here. But of course, Du Bois leaves out very fundamentally the land question, which I think is returned and has never gone away in very fundamental ways. The second problem that I've been thinking about while reading the book is similarly with decolonization, that despite a vast amount of rhetoric today, there's quite a lot of disagreement and tensions, some creative, some less so, on what it might mean in the present. These tensions have also been subject to some quite fascinating semantic drift, as with the internal colony, particularly in recent months, between refusing decolonization as some kind of unacceptable white genocidal term, and on the other hand, pointing to the nation state of Israel as the kind of exemplar, the paradigm of the best kind of decolonization. And there is kind of very interesting tension and a kind of return of that discomfort with the idea of decolonization. And I think at this moment, I do want to note that we are having this discussion as thousands of our fellow human beings are being subjected to a genocide in the name, in some ways, in the kind of perverse name of decolonization itself, are being cleansed in the name of a very skewed understanding of what decolonization might be. I also wonder if the critique of the idea of the first new nation discourse in relation to the United States can also be expanded into assessing the limitations of the Westphalian order, the nation-state order that emerged in the Bandung era. I think, from where I'm situated anyway, I see writ large some of the failures of that Bandung moment, because as a genocide is underway, as an illegal war has been just once again initiated amongst many illegal wars, where is the world that Bandung was supposed to create? Where are those states? Where are those states that asserted national sovereignty against the might of white supremacist European colonialism? Where are they? And I think, I was very much put in mind while reading the book of the kind of failures of solidarity, even as multiple peoples are in solidarity with the Palestinians, with Iranian people. The states have signally failed to coalesce around some kind of understanding of solidarity. And so I think, in all honesty, I was also thinking, and there's a lovely quotation from Senghor on page 106. And when I think of the direction of some of the big players in the so-called global South, I was put in mind of this. What good is our independence, Senghor asks, if it is only to imitate European totalitarianism, to replace external colonialism by domestic colonialism? And certainly when it comes to some of the large nation states of the global South, that is a very apt question. And so I just wonder if the kind of critique of the first new nation as actually fundamentally colonizing, fundamentally premised on colonialism might not actually be, and I know this is a controversial thing to say at this particular moment in time, but that, is there something in the dynamic of the Westphalian nation state that makes it, in a sense, prey to the dynamics of colonialism? I'll just wind up by touching on a couple of other themes and phrases that resonated for me. I thought the question of shared condition while maintaining distinct historical experiences, which Sam discusses in relation to Jack Odell, is an important one. And I think, but again, we're left with the question of also the failures of solidarity, of recognizing common condition, or parlaying that understanding of common condition into something like solidarity. So I think these are just my kind of very brief comments on the book. There are lots of other things to say. I was put in mind while reading the book of Richard Wright's very, very long excursus into what happens at Bandung in his famous The Color Curtain. And he goes to Bandung, and there are a couple of things happening there. There, on the one hand, he's very clear that this is an important moment of being of solidarity, of the colored peoples of the world, the darker nations, coming together and really coalescing around the idea of anti-racist resistance, of the time of the West is over, and now it is the time of the colored peoples of the world to speak. But there is also this real tension, which he displays here, and then even more starkly when a year later he goes to the first conference of Black writers and artists in Paris in 1956, which is organized by Présence Africaine. And he's, on the one hand, he can see the solidarity, but on the other hand, he and even others more surprising like Baldwin are very torn by a sense of also feeling American at the same time, and feeling that America is being criticized and not being happy about being the target of the US being the target of criticism. And then, Richard Wright really fumbles, both in The Color Curtain and later on, he talks about how nonetheless we must value European ideas, and that the West has given us certain conceptions of self-determination and freedom, which we actually have to acknowledge and embrace. And I don't know how many of you will remember that when he goes to Paris in 1956, he doesn't want to give the speech that he has written, because he realizes that he has fantastically misjudged the context into which he's going to give that speech. But that kind of residual allegiance to the West and to the United States, I thought was an interesting contradiction in Wright. And I was just kind of put in mind of that while reading. Anyway, thank you very much for a very rich book. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Professor Gopal. I give now the floor, without further ado, to Professor Dayo Gore.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, John and Yosra. It's a real pleasure to be here. It gave me a reason to read this book I've been hearing a lot about, but and to make some time for it. And it's a real honor to be among such a diverse and insightful group of scholars who've said a lot of the things I have to say about the book. But I'm going to try to go for a conversational mode here and talk a little bit about how I'm approaching the book and a little bit about where my perspective, and then some of the things that I find useful, and then some questions. We'll see if I can do all that, respecting the 7-minute limit. Maybe you'll get a portion of it. And so let me just start a little bit with where I'm coming from, my perspective. That I just completed a draft of a manuscript that looks at Black women in the U.S. and transnational travels and activism in what I'm calling the long 20th century. So from about the 1890s to about the 1980s. And it picks particular moments. Some of the early parts focuses on Ida B. Wells' travels to London and Scotland in 1892 and 94 for her anti-lynching campaign and her organizing there. And then also Mary Church Terrell's travels in Europe and living in France for about a year, and then returning for a number of women's conferences in Berlin and traveling to London later on, and her later involvement in the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, and eventually with petitions to the United Nations when she's quite senior. So that's the early part. And then I have a chapter that looks at this period that Internal Colony looks at the post-war period, but particularly through Thelma Dale and the National Negro Congress work. And then I have a chapter on Vicki Garvin and Black expatriates in China during the Cultural Revolution. And then it ends with the transnational campaign to free Angela Davis in the 1970s. So really trying to think about a Black internationalism that emerges early and has a sustained sort of features throughout the 20th century and how it shifts in different moments, but also I think taking as its point maybe to sort of dual argument that one, we have to think about the ways in which Black internationalism has long been sort of a framework within African American struggle around liberation, and thinking transnationally or internationally has been a part of that Black freedom struggle in the US for quite a while, but also just the ways in which women have been active in that, and gender politics have shaped and informed those politics. And I really take the point, much of this work, right, when we think about African American transnational internationalism, Black internationalism, tends to be consumed within the Cold War context, and it ends up being sort of I think the historiography puts out very clear delineations of timelines. And I like, one of the first things I like about this book is that it pushes us to think about these timelines is not so rigid. The Cold War is not all consuming, even though it is an important force in these moments, and to think about ideology, the fluidity of ideology. So in my own work, I try to think about that, if you could, because it goes from people we might think of as part of that early civilization, African American leading decolonial efforts in Africa as sort of talented 10th leadership, to a third world politics where people are thinking about internal colony, thinking about what it means to be in the quote unquote belly of the beast. And to see that shifts over time, I think is, and the fluidity of that someone like Mary Church Terrell might start as a investment in the US nation state and end sort of dismissive of even the United Nations possibilities for creating change. When her petitions and her support of the We Charge Genocide petition that happens in the 1950s. So that's the broader project. And so I entered the book, I just say that, I entered the book with that sort of in mind, and it particularly, this moment just came to me as I started reading it. In one of my sections, I look at the work of the National Negro Congress, and particularly Thelma Dale, who's in leadership of this in the early post-war years, and they're thinking about a Black international politics. A lot of their members come back from World War II, and they're sort of on fire about the decolonization movements they have witnessed on the ground where they are. A lot of them are coming from what's happening in Indochina. Some of them have been in Europe, and then they come back and they are talking about what are we going to do? How do we build our support of this? How are we in conversation with these movements that are happening? And that it also is occurring around what's happening on the African continent. And the National Negro Congress writes this statement in 1945, and I'll just read it because this is what struck me. I carried with me, and I'll sort of fuel some of my points. The Negro people of America are the victims of the same forces who are today attempting to enslave the colonial peoples. And it goes along, and then they end. Then the fight for a free China for the Chinese people is not only a fight for their freedom, but is a fight for the freedom of the people of India, of Java, of Africa, and the minority peoples of America. And I just thought in that quote, you could see the early formulations of some of these debates that are so central to Professor Klug's book. And in part, I talk about that in a lot around sort of a third world politics that emerges, but it clearly also, I appreciate what the work does to tie it into longer discussions. And I'll start with, and that sort of leads me to one of my big appreciations of what this work does, is that it introduces us to this question of internal colony through, in part, the 1928 Black Belt thesis and the ways it allowed for powerful interventions from Harry Hayward and African Americans in the U.S. left. Not so much, I think, and the book points this out, as a sort of strategy or practice, right? That the idea of creating the Black Belt was not actually what the U.S. Communist Party sort of put into action, but it did open up all this space. And I guess I should put a pause around that, because today we see things like Cooperative Jackson and other efforts around land trust and things that continue to raise that question of land and labor for African Americans. In conjunction, I think, with what Glen points out is the ongoing debates about settler colonialism. But I thought that the book does this way of showing how that opens up an ongoing conversation among African Americans over the status of being national minorities and theorizing nationalism. That's so central conversation in the Communist International in this moment. So it allows them to mobilize some of that power to have a greater space in the U.S. Communist Party and the Black left. And it produces what I think the book shows us is some creative thinking and organizing and theorizing about Black people's relationships to the nation, to land, and I think to racial capital. And so that is one of the things that we can see this long genealogy of internal colonialism as taking on different modes, and how the question of the nation becomes a central way in which people are trying to think through the African American experience. And I also would argue think through racial capitalism. And so I appreciate that about the book, as centering that as a point where we can start, even as I think much too often the Black Belt thesis in general gets dismissed as sort of wacky plan that never has any longevity, but I think it does do some important work. Two, I think I really appreciate the emphasis on the optimism of the early 1940s, because partly my reading of the book is what leads people to Phelps Stokes, what makes Du Bois imagine that he can have a conversation with liberals about decolonization, is a real hope the Black left and even left liberals emerge out of World War II with. This sense that they have built a coalition, there is a profound sort of dismantling of white supremacy. Maybe there's a check on capitalism, that's the question. And there is a restructuring in global politics, and decolonization will have the voice in that. And in that voice, national minorities might also have a force in that, which they think about African Americans as. And I just think often because we know the Cold War is looming, it consumes that moment of optimism and hope and vision that people bring to it. And I think often of Paul Robeson, he makes this speech, I think in 45, that's very optimistic, and it always gets quoted back as sort of how could he imagine that this is what was happening. But I like the ways in which the book points to 45, the Manchester Conference in Europe in 45, all these different gatherings that happened that were drawing in people in labor, women's organizations, decolonization efforts, that because they were imagining the power they could have in restructuring that, and sort of having some impact on the political restructuring that was happening in this moment. And while you might count some of it as naivete or misplaced belief in their alliances and a really underestimating of sort of the ways in which racial capitalism was invested, in Western powers were invested in racial capitalism, even if it meant a continuing of colonization. And they were thinking about ways that you could negotiate those two things. I do think it did speak to some of the power of what they had built during the wartime. And so I want to acknowledge that optimism and think about sort of what actually was successful in that moment that they were able to build, right? Because I think that period often gets just swept up in the overwhelming power and sort of devastation that the Cold War brings to many of the left activists in this moment. And the third thing I'll say that I really appreciated was the ways in which we could see, I think Priya may have talked about a component of this, but we see the sort of back and forth and engagements from multiple sort of vectors, right, in this movement. And I think how one of the things I found really interesting is how we see Black international political thought, like this is one of the key arguments that Sam makes, as having a profound influence on US sort of policy and practices around decolonization and liberal intellectuals in this moment. But I would suggest also what we see under that is the real influence of a Black left political theorizing that seeps into, right? It really makes clear the ways in which a Black left is more expansive than how we might think about figures who are seen as that pre-Cold War, the Black left is expansive. Bunches having conversations with people who are in the Communist Party, Du Bois is, Cruz is. We see a lot of folks, A. Philip Randolph, Claudia Jones, all these people in conversation with each other. And I think I like the ways the book allows for the possibility of seeing what that really vibrant conversation, political disagreements produce, and how the longevity it has, even if it's not in the same terms in which people had articulated it, right? So I think in part, the questions around how do you think about African American, that started in 1928 and earlier about Black land and labor, that are emerging out of the left, then seep into the Black activists and organizing, and then we see it still shaping debates among left liberals around the US role in decolonization. I do think what I wish we had had more in that moment is a little bit of what makes it impossible, right? Why these are always failed conversations, right? So I think on the one hand, it makes visible why Du Bois might end up in that room, because he feels this option of hope. But why is it always impossible? Why does this always produce failed conversations? And what are the limits that they bring to the table, the left liberals, in that moment? And some of that is about, I would argue, the structures of white supremacy. And I guess I've given myself up. The other part, I think, is about racial capitalism. So I'll leave that there for my 3 points there. So I like that. And I always love work that, the last thing I'll say about point 3 is I always saw work that highlights the expansiveness of sort of political theorizing, right? That in some ways, it's not that they didn't have ideological points, but it was a conversation where many people felt they had points of entry, right? Even if they had different visions of it. And I think too often in African American history, and particularly US history, we like to imagine these ideas and political thought as so bounded, right? That you're a liberal or you're a leftist or you're a nationalist. And we really see in this work, and I try to argue in my own work, the ways in which those were, people drew from many different venues of thought to develop their ideas and think creatively about change, because they were invested in certain political projects, but open to thinking differently about them. And this will lead me to my 2 questions. Hopefully I've not gone too far over time. One is that, and this is a purely my own interest, so I'll start there. I'm interested in sort of the ways in the internal colony gets formulated through the ideas of a third world solidarity or third world and politics. And I noticed it's not really central in the book until you get to the epilogue. And then we see a reference to the third world more often, and the reference in particular to the Third World Women's Alliance. And I just would wonder if you could talk a little bit about do you see the book as charting the genealogy of the Third World Women's Alliance, right? Or this organization in whole or part? And if so, where, right? Because in part that Third World Women's Alliance emerges out of the post-1965 SNCC, but it still carries this sort of idea of a national minority, like living in the belly of beast, but it tries to, I think through some of the contradictions through this Third World Solidarity Alliances. And so I'm curious about that. And then the second question, which is a little more just about African-American politics and sort of political thought in general during this period, and it's maybe a two-parter. I think the figures in this book are idiosyncratic, maybe we could say. Cruz is a notable, one. But I think even someone like Ralph Bunche, Walter White, even Du Bois, right, is noted for his turn to the left where people like, we can discount that or not. And I'm curious what that says about the story you tell, right? Is it something about these figures who are trying to bridge a left liberal divide? Like they're invested, I think someone had mentioned their investments, Richard Wright is another, investments in Western colonial that make them want to have these conversations to sustain it? Or do you think they're more representative of these broader conversations? I'm just curious about that because, it's a group of dudes that, I don't know, if you got them in the same room, I don't know, you wouldn't get a word in. And I think traverse sort of the left liberal conservative range in ways that are, I feel like, unique, but maybe there's a different point to be made about that.
Thank you so much, Professor Gore. I'll give the floor now to our last but not least, Professor John Narayan. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for everyone for their comments. It's been great. I'm just gonna time myself because the book's so good. I could be here for a long time. So thank you, Sam, for writing it. For those of you who don't have it, get it. If you can't buy it, I'm all for downloading it illegally. But anyway, yeah, however you get it, read it. It's really good, freedom of knowledge. Right. So what I want to say is I don't want to rehash the narration of the book. I think it's wonderful. It's actually quite brilliant for me because I was writing a juxtaposition of the history of dependency theory and anti-racism, and then I had to read this book, and I was like, wow, okay, this was like divine intervention, right? So I think what the book does for me, and I'm going to talk about my interests, which are in political economy and also the politics of anti-racism as internationalism, is kind of try and bring those things together. So what Sam does so good in the book is to kind of say two things, right? One I think is underplayed, but let's get to it. One is that there is a direct relation between the processes of decolonization and the kind of internal anti-racism Black liberation struggle in the US, but also that those things were actually happening in parallel before then. So what we see are lots of terms and ideas actually articulated in one space, also articulated in another space, and not technically always linked together, but then in the future, they become singed together, right? So think about Claudia Jones. She's using terms like super exploitation long before Marini's doing it in Brazil, but in a different context, right? And then as we go through to the 60s and 70s, we see the influence of dependency theory and the kind of people who have got annoyed that modernization theory will not lead to the liberation of post-colonial states. We see Fanon and Nkrumah and a whole bunch of others across Latin America put on a full critique of what is essentially development, right? And it's somewhat ironic that sometimes the ideas aren't designed to travel. So Sam really reminds us that Fanon didn't see his ideas, which is so ironic, right? Didn't see his ideas as really applicable to the Black liberation struggle as it was then in the civil rights movement, right? In Wretched of the Earth, there's that bit, which is really funny considering that's going to become the Black Bible for the Black Panther Party, right? Which shows you that sometimes even the idea of the conversation is a conversation that's had, which was never designed to be a conversation, which I thought was really, really interesting. So we see these parallel developments between this attempt to narrate why, in a sense, post-colonial states aren't allowed to develop. At the same time, the Black liberation struggle is narrating why it isn't allowed to develop. And in some ways, it's good to see 64, 65 as the kind of independence moment Fanon warns about, both outside of the US, but also inside of the US, right? So it's a warning to how in a sense liberation can happen. And I think that's really interesting when you see those parallels between essentially how do we have a dodgy indigenous leadership? How do we get economic development? These are the questions of Wretched the Earth, and they're the same questions that African Americans find most pertinent to themselves, and this expands itself. And I feel one of the things that the book does really well is to show you the limitations of some of the ideas of dependency theory, for example, which simply narrated a kind of core periphery relationship, whereas the Black liberation struggles take on those very elements, showed you the internal racial capitalist dynamics within the core, right? So it wasn't just simply that you had a racialized welfare system in the West and then it was all kind of raw materials and extraction from the South. You had a multiplicity of capitalist social relations underpinned by race and gender exploitation, which allowed the core to kind of function. And the kind of Black liberation struggles knowledge is very, very good on that. So much so that if you go back, and I'm not going to read the quote, but if you read a wonderful eulogy from Walter Rodney on George Jackson, right? He points to the direct link between the struggles, both in the core and outside the core. So that's where I think the book's wonderful. As an academic, I have to critique something. So I'm going to critique a little bit, but not necessarily think. I just want to push a little bit at some stuff. So in the final bits of the book, the idea of the internal colony is kind of shown to be its life force is kind of held with the third world, right? So as the third world declines as a project, in itself, internal colonization also kind of wanes, and we have a little bit of, at the end of the book, Sam kind of links it to the third world debt crisis and that emergence of structural adjustment, all that wonderful stuff that the US enforced order did to the old third world. But there's an interesting thing here where I think we could take a step back. So things like the new international economic order and its collapse obviously are in a sense problematic, but in a sense they're not the whole story, right? So by the late 60s and 70s, it's quite clear that it's not just decolonization that's having an impact on the Black liberation struggle, but also the ideas of the Black liberation struggle are reframing what it means to decolonize and what it is to be in kind of that process with a state. So the Black Panther Party here are quite good for this because essentially, as Sam narrates in their book, they give up the idea of decolonizing, and Huey Newton creates this idea of intercommunalism. But actually what underpins all of that, apart from the crazy actions of the US state and its counterintelligence program, are in a sense real ramifications about the decolonization process. So as Glen kind of narrated Mao's early enthusiasm for the Black liberation struggle in the 60s, by 1971, Mao is meeting Nixon and creating normalization. By the early 1970s, the Algerians who had hosted a foreign embassy for the Black Panther Party have kicked them out and signed a natural gas deal with the US. So in a sense, the limits of a national state project as the linkages for Black liberation become more and more pronounced, right? And this in itself is a bit of an issue. And I think one of the things that comes out of the book is how does one organize a people who necessarily don't have a state to win, unless you do want to win the American state, I don't know, with people who had a state to win in the decolonization process, and how do you hold that project together? Because I think that's still pertinent to our present. That's the kind of present we're talking about when we talk about Palestine, right? So to piggyback on what Priya was saying. So that's a question. And then finally, I think the kind of things I would like to, couple of questions is, how do we think the internal colonization thesis has turned up again linked to this present moment, but I'm thinking of that last historical F-up that the US world order did to us, which was called the War on Terror, and the expansion of carcerality in the US. Is there grounds there to see the return of those ideas in those parameters, especially as we've seen a kind of more, I don't want to say return, it's more of kind of visible idea of fascism in the US, right? And then finally, just to wrap up really quickly, I've gone over 7 minutes. I think one of the book's key things, and I really love that you retrieved the Boggs's work because I think it's so good. I think it's so good. Is in a sense that political economy of the changing nature of what's happening in the core and what's happening in the periphery is a problematic, right? How do you link surplus populations with super exploited populations crisscrossing across these different things And again, in that period of, in that idea of, well, how does that relate to a state? And I think that probably is something we have to think through together, is how do we create forms of solidarity across the different forms of relationships that capitalism puts into place. Some of those are wage labor, some of those are being surplus population, some of those are actually, you know, the victims of genocide. And I think that's something we might want to think back together. But overall, Sam, I love the book. Thank you so much for reading it, for writing it, for me reading it.
Thank you, John. We all do. Sam, I'll give you the floor now to answer all the readers and, you know, questions, comments, and add if you have anything to add.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm overwhelmed. This is what a pleasure and an honor to be read by such brilliant scholars, and to have all of these engagements with the book. So I'll just say, first off, thank you to Professor Munro and Professor Amraoui for putting this together and inviting me and hosting the series. And thank you to all 5 readers and panelists for your engagement and your wonderful comments and questions. I'm going to try to address as much as I can, but realizing the shortness of the time, I'm sure there will be certain things that I don't hit on. I'm going to start by kind of bunching, I think, a few different folks' questions that I thought really connected with each other. And a lot of the questions, and this comes out of Priya's comments and questions as well as John's just now, but I think it was also touched on in different ways by really all by Wassel and Glen and Dayo as well, is this question of kind of the nation state and sovereignty and the place of that in relation to the internal colony concept, in relation to the prospect of forging solidarities between African Americans and other, you know, oppressed minorities within, you know, to use the language John used, within the core and peoples in the periphery. And, you know, Priya, you kind of provocatively posed the question of whether we could extend the kind of concept of internal colonialism to more or less qualify the entire Westphalian nation-state order as colonial. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book by examining this concept and its various usages and the kind of political possibilities that it opens up is to really press on this question of what defines coloniality, how it's been understood over time by different groups of people. And, you know, for so many of the actors that I'm writing about, the question of how the formal system of colonialism should end and what would take its place was extraordinarily central. And this is where Dayo's comments come in as well. This notion that there was an openness in the middle of the 20th century for so many Black thinkers and activists that I look at, and of course actors all around the decolonizing world in the Caribbean and Africa, in Asia as well, that the institutional form of a post-colonial world was not a settled question when a lot of these concepts are being developed, when a lot of this intellectual work is being done. And of course, there's been, you know, magnificent work done on the kind of alternative imaginings of the kind of institutional international order that might follow after colonialism by, you know, political theorists like Adom Getachew and historians like, you know, Fred Cooper and many others that I could speak of. And so, in some ways, what I'm trying to identify with the book is that prior to formal decolonization in the 50s and 60s, there's already a kind of shared understanding by many Black radicals of the limitations of sort of independent nation statehood within colonial borders as the horizon of possibility for movements for decolonization. And that's why they're sort of invested in, you know, in the earlier chapters of the book, that's why they're invested in what I call this kind of anticipatory critique of neocolonialism, that even before the fall of, you know, the British Empire, in many of these debates are cited in Ghana in particular, even before Ghanaian independence, many Black radical thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic are identifying the potential problems of simply kind of assuming the power within a state that has already been kind of formed and bounded by the history of colonialism that has produced them. And so, I think that at the same time, you have for many of these actors a sense that some form of political sovereignty and self-determination is necessary in order to engage in these broader projects of undoing the kind of racialized economic exploitation that's at the heart of the colonial order. And so that's a real kind of paradox, right? Identifying the limits of the nation state while also understanding that some kind of seat of formal sovereignty is a necessary precondition for broader kind of global transformations is, I think, a paradox that we're really still living with in many ways. And for Black radicals within the United States, those kinds of debates and questions, I think, are especially vexing to their understandings of, for folks who have embraced this idea of internal colonialism, for their kind of positive programs on what should be done about that. And so you have certain groups within the United States on the Black left and in the Black Power movement who really are kind of focused on the possibility of gaining some kind of formal political foothold for to use Eldridge Cleaver's term, for the kind of projection of sovereignty, right? And some of these take very kind of traditionalist forms in their imagination. Dayo, you brought up the Black Belt thesis, which is, of course, a kind of really core origin point for this whole broader discourse of internal colonialism after the Second World War. Most of the kind of understandings of internal colonialism after the Second World War are not tied to the specific territory of the Black Belt in the South, but some of them are. The Republic of New Africa, for instance, is one such group that's formed in Detroit, Michigan, but quickly sets its sights on kind of instantiating a project of African American formal sovereignty in the Black Belt in the South. In some ways, I think also their project in particular speaks to some of the ways that to bring in some of Glen's comments here, speaks to some of the kind of contradictions between the internal colonial analysis and a kind of settler colonial analysis that would recognize kind of pre-existing indigenous claims to that very same land. But for most of the Black radicals who embrace the kind of internal colony thesis or the internal colonial analysis, they're trying to think more expansively beyond that question of, well, can we find a specific, kind of territorial basis for Black sovereignty within the United States from which we can form our own kind of path of development. And this, and John, I'm glad that you brought up the bogs, is I think this is one of the real things that we can take into the present from the Boggs's work. Some of the James and Grace Lee Boggs, is who I'm referring to, again, Detroit-based activists and writers, really central to the Black Power movement in Detroit and to many developments after, in that city as well. And their formulations of internal colonization, which are based in this understanding of racial capitalism and racial oppression as a kind of combination of capitalist dynamics, racialization, spatial segregation, and so on. They really see the way out of this as trying to embrace kind of cross coalitional solidarities for the purpose of making possible some kind of form of multiracial democracy at a municipal level that might then be replicated at a kind of federal and even kind of international level. And so, one could see this as a kind of utopian vision, but I think there's something in that vision that goes beyond some of the problematics of the ways that the nation state form can itself kind of replicate many of the problems of coloniality that several of you identified in your comments. Another kind of shared theme that I think came across in these terrific sets of comments and questions was, how does this relate to the present moment? Are there kind of resources in the tradition of thinking about internal colonialism that we might draw from, or that contemporary movements might draw from? Wassel, you mentioned how do I see the concept evolving today in light of globalization, digital technology, and so on, as well as kind of how does the Black Lives Matter movement reflect, challenges or dynamics of the internal colony thesis? And Priya as well, you brought up this question of how how might this speak to questions today? And John, you also brought up this idea of, is there a ground for return of this analysis in the present moment? And so, this is a question I've thought about a lot. The reference to Black Lives Matter, I think, is helpful in part because this book started to take shape. It was my doctoral dissertation, and I started working on it really at in some ways, at a very vibrant period in Black Lives Matter activism. I started working on this really in kind of 2015 to 16 as a dissertation, and that is kind of right, after or in the midst of and after the Ferguson uprising and the Baltimore uprising, in that period of that movement. And so, that movement was very much like in my mind when I was thinking through the project and coming up with my kind of agenda for it. And of course, the movement has developed quite a lot in the intervening decade. I think even to speak of a kind of unified Black Lives Matter movement at this point in time is much harder maybe than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago, although there were differences in those moments as well. But something I found really striking in that kind of earlier moment of that movement's activism was how very self-consciously internationalist it was. In 2015, the Movement for Black Lives released a policy platform that included quite a lot of kind of framing of their demands surrounding policing in the United States, surrounding disinvestment and investment in Black communities in relation to the kind of global context of the history of colonialism and the slave trade, and the sense that their more local demands were connected to this kind of question of global solidarity. And so that was inspiring in terms of the work that I was trying to do. I think whether the question of whether the specific kind of language of internal colonialism deserves to be kind of resurrected in this moment, to me, obviously the book is a testimony to the fact that I think that vocabularies of social movements are very important. And I wouldn't want to kind of prescribe one particular word or set of words for particular movements to adopt. I mean, there's a reason why I think the language of colonialism and decolonization has come back into vogue in a very intense way recently. Reasons relating to, of course, the Israeli genocide in Gaza, relating to the notion of the rising popularity of framework of settler colonialism that would link that to previous genocides of indigenous peoples and so on. And so, one thing I hope my book will do is, in some ways serve as a rejoinder to the people who say, well, what's colonialism got to do with us? The United States, we are this kind of first new nation archetype. Like, this is just a kind of imported language that, a bunch of people cooked up in the academy, or, doesn't really fit various circumstances. And, one thing I think the book can do is to say, actually Americans, African Americans centrally, but Americans of all stripes, including, very kind of mainstream liberal elites and so on, have really cared a lot about what the definition of colonialism is and how American systems of racial and class oppression link up with or don't link up with that global system of colonialism, that's been a problematic that a lot of Americans have cared about and thought about very deeply for a very long time. And so I do think, you know, leaving aside the specific language of internal colonization, that is something I think my book can kind of show or prove in the context of current debates. The other thing I think that I hope that the book might you know, kind of humbler hope in terms of how the book might relate to kind of some of these present conversations is that all of the attempts to think through the internal colony language take as a given that supposedly domestic forms of racial violence, of unequal political economy, of, you know, segregation and segmented labor markets along racialized lines and so on, that all of those quote unquote domestic problems can be better understood in a framework of international politics and the global order. And so each of the thinkers that I kind of treat in the book might have a different analysis of how those things link up, and that diversity and those disagreements I think are really important to underscore. But they do share that conception. And I think that conception is really important in our present moment. Whether that conception gets articulated through a language of internal colonialism or not is sort of, you know, not something I would necessarily want to weigh in on, or necessarily say, you know, want to prescribe in any kind of a way. But that, I think, that particular point of view is really relevant today when we have, you know, at the same time that we have, you know, of course, many activists have made the connections between the kind of militarization of policing and American, you know, projections of military power abroad in the era of the War on Terror, but also in terms of political economy, you know, at the same time that we have debt crises in Ghana and Zambia that are being undemocratically managed by the IMF, debt crises in, you know, the American colony of Puerto Rico and the American city of Detroit are also subject to the same kind of anti-democratic forms of political economic management, and seeing those connections and making them clear is something that I think movements in the present should do and are doing, frankly. So that's kind of what I'd have to say to that. I know I don't want to take much more time. I'm just going to quickly address a couple of specific questions. Glen, you brought up the kind of the contradictory position vis-a-vis indigenous dispossession and the settler colonial analysis, and how that contributed to or bespoke in some ways some of the decline of the internal colony thesis. I think something that I came to think a lot about in the course of writing this book is how the indigenous experience within the United States, which formulations of the internal colony thesis are kind of aware of it or speak to it, and which occlude it. And, you know, in some ways, there are, I think, versions of the internal colony thesis that are quite resonant with indigenous critiques of, you know, the history of genocide and dispossession in the United States. I actually think that the Boggs's version of this, even though they don't speak directly to indigenous experiences all that much, is one that is kind of open to and shares a lot with that kind of critique, whereas others, I think, are much more occlusive of it. And so that kind of became a dividing line, or yeah, that I became more and more interested in as I kind of wrote the book. Your discussion of the Canadian Red Power engagements with the internal colonialism were really fascinating. I don't know anything about that, and I would love to learn more. And I look forward to reading the work that you're working on as well. You brought up China as well, and Dayo did too. And, you know, it is true that of course, you know, the various influences from the decolonizing world that I trace in the book, which are especially, you know, those of Frantz Fanon, as several of you mentioned, but also Kwame Nkrumah, and they are largely focused on kind of movements for decolonization in Africa in particular. But of course, the range of global engagements that civil rights and Black Power activists had, were quite expansive. And so I wouldn't want to claim anything regarding kind of comprehensiveness in tracing all of those lines of influence. There has been some really good work, and it seems like Dayo's forthcoming work on Vicky Garvin will add to this on the work of or the connections between Black radicalism in the U.S. and Mao's China. Rudy Duan is another young scholar working on this as well. And I think that certainly the influence of the PRC and Mao became more and more heightened as we got into the end of the 1960s and certain camps within the Black Panther Party, and then as we move forward, very obviously influential in some of the kind of 1970s movements, the new communist movement in particular. People like Amiri Baraka becoming much more engaged with the ideas of Mao and Maoism, taking on more of a role. And in some ways, you could see that as an evolution of some of the thinking about internal colonialism. In some ways, I think it also reflects a kind of displacement of the kind of internal colonial analysis from the scene. Let's see. There's many more questions to that that I could answer here, but yeah, let me just I'll close by just saying kind of one last thing, because I do want to leave open some time for Q&A. John, your last question about the kind of political economy of core and periphery, and this question of surplus populations and super exploited populations, both inside and outside of the core countries. I mean, that really gets at, I think, something that is core to what I was trying to do with the book, which is trace a kind of history of especially kind of Black radical analyses that tried to link up the question of formal colonialism and its economically exploitative project with this forms of super exploitation, both of labor, but also in a kind of consumerist mode that operate through the system of racial capitalism in the United States. And to today, I think one of the thinkers that has provided a lot of resources in terms of how we might think through some of those problems is actually the late Joshua Clover, whose work I don't think I cite in the book, but has been very influential on terms of kind of how I think about some of those problematics. So I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for your engagement and your great questions. I know I only answered a fraction of them, but I would love to continue the conversation as we go forward too.
Wow, Sam, I didn't want you to stop, but we unfortunately have to give, unfortunately for you, you're going to receive so many questions from our lovely audience, whom I'd like to thank for sticking up so late with us. And, I know you're connected from different time zones. I'll give you the floor now, John, to moderate the Q&A. Thank you very much, Sam. Lots of love and hearts. Excellent explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosra. And thanks, Sam. Yeah, as I was listening to all these brilliant comments from all the readers, I was like, how the hell is Sam going to speak to all this? It's such a range, and you just did it so well. And thank you. That's so nice finishing with the reference to Joshua Clover there. That's really fitting. So we'll close this by the end of the hour. We have about half an hour to go. And it's kind of an open forum. The readers who have spoken already, you are very much welcome to, oh, Priya, your hand is there. Oh, it's clapping, okay. But please use the hand raise function if you would. And it would be great if the readers want to speak to each other, or if they want to say more things to Sam, or obviously more broadly in the audience, if people have questions, the floor is open. Osama.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Yosra. Thank you, everyone, for this very insightful conversation. Thank you, Sam, for your amazing explanation. Thank you to the panelists for your interesting questions. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, Sam, if that's okay. And I'm going to draw on a few points that you already mentioned and that were debated during this discussion. I'm going to start by something you mentioned at the beginning of your book when you said that, and I quote here, descriptions of the Black Ghetto as a prison, urban plantation, even as a concentration camp proliferated, which I found the similarity here and the assimilation that you made between ghettos and concentration camps. I found it very interesting because to me it highlights the racialized, at least, notions of confinement, that are deployed within the US, within liberal democracy, if you're trying to be a little bit more theoretical about this. And the US maintains an unmatched domestic prison-industrial complex, and internationally it supports the use of open-air imprisonment in places like Gaza while supporting a genocidal settler colonial regime, which to me is a carceral state of exception. It's an external colony, drawing on the notion of internal colony. And the way I see it, the concentration camp analogy really internationalizes the condition of Black life in the United States. It connects Harlem or Ferguson even to Gaza. All three represent spaces where racialized or ethnic populations are preemptively punished, surrounded by militarized force, and historically or contemporarily denied full political rights. So the carceral state of the internal colony that you draw upon, Sam, in your book is really extended to an international paradigm that reveals a clearly defined, in my opinion, there's no real hypocrisy or paradox here. It's a clearly defined transnational racial order that is sustained through surveillance, punishment, and carcerality. And my question to you is, do you think that it is fair to argue that the US support for carceral regimes abroad really mirrors to a significant extent its own racial control structure at home? Is it time to talk about a globalized internal colony system? Should we really start emphasizing this particular concept? My second question, I'm really going to jump to the latter part of your book. And I quote again, and I found this also very interesting because you said that the migration of the concept of the internal colony into academia signaled the end of its purchase and movement politics. And this is very interesting because it really characterizes a much larger problem where the states and liberal institutions in today's world succeeded to a larger extent in absorbing the language of decolonization and stripping it of its radical implications. Decolonization is not just a linguistic phenomenon or a topic of academic debate where we have the margins to entertain ideas that colonial settler regimes can somehow be legitimized. It's really about concrete liberation. It has to have radical implications. And we see this pattern in the US, especially, where the diversity discourse, as I'm sure you're all aware, coexists in the same environment with militarized policing and racialized foreign policy. The language of decolonization is used really performatively in the Western world generally and in the US in particular, while, in my opinion at least, actual systems of domination remain largely untouched. And so again, the question here is, do you think it's fair to argue that the US transformed the concept of decolonization simply into a rhetorical export? It reduced it to a rhetorical export that promotes representation and diversity and all the right concepts, while simultaneously integrating and supporting settler and colonial practices in places like Palestine abroad and Black America at home, if you want to be critical about that. And I would like to conclude with this question, although I know it's a little bit tough, because I myself can't really answer this, but outside of the bubble of academia, where we have the luxury of debate, which is what we're doing right now, how can we revive the practical and radical implications of the decolonial discourse? How can we really make it more than just a linguistic phenomenon or a topic of academic debate? And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you so much again, Sam. This is an amazing book. Thank you, everyone, for moderating this and for being here.
Let me just say first quickly, thank you, Asema. Wonderful. I'm also guessing that others on the panel have thoughts about the questions that Asema has raised. So, Sam, I'll turn it back to you, but it's very open for others to chime in here too.
Absolutely, yes. I'd love to hear what others would say to these great questions. Thank you for the question, Asema. I'm going to start with kind of your second/third questions, which I think are related, which has to do with kind of the academia and the relation to movement politics and kind of how taking concepts and turning them into simply rhetorical devices has been historically and maybe is in the present day a means of kind of defanging them. Yeah, I mean, I did note, you know, if you Google, like when I started working on this, Google Ngrams were becoming like more and more hip to use in intellectual history, and I have various issues with that. But I did an Ngram for the various forms of my key concepts like internal colony, internal colonialism, and so on. And the kind of point at which those concepts reach their apex in the Google Ngram is kind of the late 70s and 80s. And mostly that's because it's being written about more and more in kind of academic works, especially in various fields in sociology, but also kind of certain pockets of kind of radical economics and elsewhere. You know, in fact, Donald Harris, Kamala Harris's father, who is an economist, wrote a kind of critique from a Marxist standpoint of the idea of internal colonialism within economics in the mid-1970s. But I, you know, having looked at this from the from its development within Black intellectual life and within movement politics in particular, I really did see this as a kind of owl of Minerva flying at dusk kind of story, where this concepts kind of take off in academic spheres in some ways, you know, through no fault of the academics who were making use of it in their various ways. But in some ways, it kind of came at the end of its real moment of political possibility within movement politics in the civil rights and Black power movements in particular, but more generally within movement politics as well. And so, you know, I don't think that that's necessarily a case in terms of this concept in particular of kind of academic co-optation, really. I think it's more a question in this instance of kind of lateness to the party, maybe. I don't see it necessarily in kind of conspiratorial terms in terms of what happened with the language of internal colonialism and its uptake in the academy. There are moments of clear co-optation that I write about in the book when conservatives try to kind of seize upon the popularity of this language and deploy it for the purposes of, you know, promoting Black capitalism and so on. But I don't think that's the same as what happens later. In terms of the present moment, I do think we've had a kind of defanging of the language of decolonization in terms of its greatest sites of prominence happening in terms of kind of cultural institutions, people talking about decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing museums, as though those things were possible in the absence of decolonizing the kind of system of racial capitalism that undergirds them, and others have written about. I mean, Priya has written about this extensively, so I won't belabor the point more than to say that I agree with that has indeed happened in various ways. But I think you also see vibrant debates within current day movements about, you know, what would it mean to make decolonization real, and I think that I'm heartened by that as well. Your first question about kind of carcerality and this question of the kind of globalization of the U.S. carceral system, and how that relates to some of these like prison and concentration camp comparisons and metaphors. Yeah, it's a really interesting and thought-provoking question. The mention that I make in the book of this kind of ghetto as prison and ghetto as concentration camp language, which were both operating at the same time as you had the kind of ghetto as colony language, was in some ways to say that the discourse of internal colonialism is part of a broader array of concepts. It's kind of not the only one on offer to rethink some of the systems of racialized economic exploitation and racialized violence within the United States. I think that all of those kinds of analogies or comparisons, is to use the term that I use, are in some ways related or share a kind of dissatisfaction with prevailing languages of anti-discrimination, of anti-racism as a means to inclusion within a kind of existing U.S. nation-state project that I really canvass in the later chapters of the book, and especially in the chapter on the crisis of vocabulary in the Black freedom movement. And so I think that they're they don't all mean the same thing, and the actors who use them don't always mean the same thing, but I think that they all share that kind of sense. And I think the same is true of actors today trying to think about, even the terminology of the carceral state has the kind of implication that it isn't just that there is, there's the state and part of it is this system of incarceration. It is that the state itself has become so infused by its own carceral imperatives that those imperatives are the defining features of the state, rather than other forms that we might of governance that we might want the state to play. And I think that shares something with the kind of earlier historical moment that I talk about. So I appreciate that connection.
Priya, I see your hand.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I mean, that was a great answer, Sam. Just very briefly, in answer to the question, I wasn't so much in my comments pushing against internal colonialism as a concept as probing the idea of internal versus external, which absolutely, I think, marked discussions at Bandung when it came to colonization. Bandung was really very heavily emphasizing boundedness and the distinction between the supposed inside and the supposed outside. And the relevance to this question is this, that yes, one can critique the United States and the Western Academy for performative decolonization and so on. But my question from where I stand is really also for the nations that once constituted Bandung or constituted the tricontinental subsequently, which is to say, where was decolonization beyond asserting the nation state, beyond taking over the levers of the nation state from the French or the British or the Dutch or whoever? I mean, what did decolonization happen there? In one sense, the US is an obvious and necessary, but also very easy target for this criticism. But what happened to decolonization at the hands of the leaders of Bandung and their descendants? And today, when we see what is happening in Palestine, we're seeing a lot of performative decolonization emanate from the global South. I mean, all these great performative remarks and these votes at the UN and so on, but actually absolutely no material action. And I don't necessarily mean, sending troops or planes or whatever, but, trade is not used as a weapon. There has been no material solidarity asserted. And I was looking at this, I meant to point to it during my remarks on page 199, where Sam discusses how most post-colonial states in Asia and Africa did not endorse the Panthers' call for a UN plebiscite because it not only risked alienating the United States, but because, and I'm citing here, because these nations feared that the success of any claim to self-determination by a group that could be categorized as a national minority might prompt additional claims that threaten their own national integrity, which was national integrity was a word that was used kind of like a mantra at Bandung. And we haven't talked sufficiently about the conflation of decolonization with majoritarianism and subsequently what was done to what we might call internal colonies, if we want to use that language, but that actually there hasn't been very much more than performative decolonization outside the US as well. And I think that is something we need to, particularly in the global South, for all its differences and distinctions, we need to remind ourselves of our failures in relation to that moment that Sam discusses in his book.
Thank you, Priya. Yosra.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam, for your answers. I'd like to also thank all the panelists for their wonderful interventions. My question, it's not actually a question, it's just, I would like to know your experience with your methodology, your desegregated method. You said you used juxtaposition and you tried to use different racialized spheres of debate in order to cover all the aspects in which the term internal colony was used or, changed from its local context to a transnational context. So I'm intrigued by the desegregated method you used. How challenging was it? to work with this method in such a book about terms, semantics, and vocabulary? And how did you do that?
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Yosra. Yes, I take the term desegregated method from an essay by Nathan Connolly, or NDB Connolly is what he publishes under, where he used that terminology. And juxtaposition is kind of a term that I really found useful in my writing, because I'm writing about comparisons, right? And of course, there's a whole school of comparative history, which is a history that wherein the historian is making comparisons among cases. And I really was focused on, when I kind of came to this project and was developing it, I was noticing all of these comparisons just in my sources, right? Constantly people making comparisons between some aspect of kind of American domestic politics and some aspect of the decolonizing world, or the process of decolonization, or of the concept of colonialism. And so that was, I was like, well, how can I write a book that treats these comparisons as the topic itself, right? As the objects of study, rather than using a kind of comparative method. And so I was inspired by some political theorists and American studies scholars, in particular Juliet Hooker, who uses this idea of juxtaposition, and the American studies scholar Nicole Siegel, who's written incisively, I think, about moving from a comparative optic to treating comparison as a kind of topic. So some of those kind of just theoretical works were really influential in sort of making me think, first of all, that I wasn't kind of crazy and sort of being like, what if I wrote about these comparisons? And also in kind of giving me guides to how I might do that. And Laura Stoller is another kind of major methodological figure looming over the book, who's written a lot about the politics of comparison in colonial and post-colonial contexts. So once I kind of had that grounding and had that sense that I was writing a book about comparisons, where comparisons would be the topic, and that I was going to try to kind of juxtapose them, I really was interested in connecting conversations that I think, especially in US like political and intellectual history, conversations that are not usually put together, that are usually seen as kind of distinct and unconnected. And that, there's a huge amount of literature in, the corpus of kind of recent US intellectual history in particular, that looks at development in the social sciences, among especially kind of like predominantly white, like liberal elite thinkers, and how those filter into or influence, kind of Kennedy and Johnson era liberalism in politics, right? And that whole conversation comes up in my book quite a bit. I look at how some of their, these thinkers and philanthropists and government officials' understandings of, post-colonial or colonial underdevelopment influence their understandings of, race and poverty, quote unquote, domestically. But not much of the literature on that really engaged with concurrent Black thinkers and activists who are also making comparisons between their movements and their conditions and those of the colonial and post-colonial world. And I thought that was a real shame, that people should be seeing these conversations as connected. And Dayo, who I know had to leave by now, spoke to this, I think, brilliantly in her comments, right? I think it's a real genuine problem in the historiography, especially in kind of US intellectual history, I think, in particular, that we do see these kind of political thought categories as overly bounded, and we don't allow for cross-pollinations among actors who might not agree with each other, and who might, in fact, be directly opposed in political conflict, but who are in various, obvious and more subterranean ways drawing on their competitors or their rivals or the people that they're confronting. I mean, one example of this that I talk a lot about in the book is, I spent quite a lot of time writing about Kenneth Clark, the psychologist and kind of community action leader, who is kind of one of the foremost theorists of the ghetto as colony in the early to mid 1960s. And his language and his understanding of that gets taken up enormously in the Black Power movement, but he hated the Black Power movement. He was very opposed to the Black Power movement. He thought it was kind of a complete misdirection of African-American activism after the achievements of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. So what do you do with that? You have to just accept that that's true. You can't just ignore, you can't say, well, you know, Stokely Carmichael's quoting from Kenneth Clark, but really he didn't agree with him. It's like, no, you have to kind of try to trace out the lines of influence while acknowledging that there being, you know, concepts are available for reappropriation and translation once they're out in the world. And so that was kind of one of the approaches that I tried to take, and, you know, and people might take issue with that, and that's fine. But that was kind of one of the ways that I tried to make sense of what I was seeing in my sources, which were all of these intersecting conversations that hadn't always been put together. And I thought that the idea of a quote unquote desegregated method that Connolly writes about was a nice way of kind of framing what I was trying to do there.
Super. Let me throw in a quick question if I can. I know we're almost at time, but really quickly. And it's I don't think Robert Allen came up in this whole conversation.
No.
And just the idea of internal neocolonialism, it just seems so relevant. Like, I mean, we're kind of at time, but Glenn, I would imagine you would have things to say about internal neocolonialism in kind of nation-to-nation agreements within the Canadian state vis-a-vis Indigenous communities kind of context, or anyone here. And so maybe I'll just leave it as a comment, but it just seems like a really important concept to keep thinking with. I think maybe the conclusion to this is, Sam, we need a new edition of Black Awakening in Capitalist America, with you writing the new introduction to it. Maybe that's the way to go with this. But I just wanted to make sure that we got that into the conversation, just because it's come up in different ways, but it's just just feels like such a contemporary kind of concept to be continuing to think with. Any last quick comments or questions before we begin to draw things to a close? In that case, I'll say a couple more words, and Yosra, I'll let you say the last word. But just last thing for me is, you know, this book obviously has generated a lot of conversation over the last couple hours and a lot of thoughts. But what I love about a book that really engages my mind is one that engages me on the topic of the book, and one that engages me in topics kind of that extend considerably beyond the topic of the book. And Priya, I'll be thinking in more new ways about, like, the Westphalian system. And, you know, it's a challenge for me to think, if not Westphalia, then what? You know, it's such a difficult question, and this book leads us to, sorry, can someone get that? It leads us to your book, Sam. You know, it's about this topic in U.S. history in a global context, but it leads us to such broader kind of concerns. And if Dayo is still here too, I'd want to talk more about the problems of the left liberal alliance, like at the moment. Like, what does it mean to engage in a kind of popular front style politics at the moment? Is that the direction to go in, or have we learned the lessons? We know where that leads, and therefore no. These are not questions I have answers to, but they're profound questions that your book and this conversation leave me with, and I'll be continuing to think about. So I just want to say thanks. This is just really fantastic session, as I expected it would. I will stop here, and Yosra, leave the last word to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sam. You know, I was writing an article about African-American prison literature, and your book came in so handy. I used it so much. Then, you know, I couldn't be but thankful today for the stimulating talk and discussions. This is intellectually, this is going to make me dream for the night. I think everybody has had enough food for thought, for future projects, for future research, for more theories, more methodologies to think about when we use this term, because I think you addressed something. I was talking to my colleagues earlier that we don't teach the origin of the term when we talk about post-colonialism in the US with regards to the Black community, or to African Americans. And your book covers something, a big chunk of a theoretical framework or a semantic framework that is still missing in our schools today, at least in our departments. So thank you, everyone, for the thought-provoking discussion, for your feedback, and we're looking forward to see you again in September, on the 25th of September, to discuss Cartographies of Empire. This is going to be our first shot at discussing road literature with Micah. Till we see you again, stay safe, everyone. Bye.